On the morning of March 14th, 1891, a groundskeeper employed by Bartholomew's Hospital in Providence, Rhode Island, discovered a leather satchel beneath the bench outside the admissions ward. The bag had been placed with deliberate care, not dropped or forgotten. Inside were 47 photographic plates, each depicting a freshly turned grave. No names, no markers, only earth and shadow. Beneath the plates lay a handwritten ledger, its entries precise and methodical, listing dates, depths, and soil conditions. The final page contained a single sentence: "I have come to confess what cannot be forgiven." The man who carried that satchel had walked through the hospital doors at dawn. He gave his name as Samuel Brenner. He was 34 years old. He asked to speak with someone in authority. When the intake nurse inquired about his ailment, he replied that he was not ill, but that he had done work that required documentation. He was calm. His boots were caked with cemetery mud. By noon, the Providence police had been summoned. By evening, the contents of his satchel had been examined by 3 separate officials, each of whom emerged from the evidence room with expressions that witnesses later described as grave and shaken. What followed was not a trial in the conventional sense, but an inquest, a methodical excavation of truth that would consume the spring and summer of that year. The investigation was led by Dr. Amos Whitmore, the hospital's chief alienist, a man trained in both medicine and the nascent science of criminal psychology. Dr. Whitmore had studied under Benjamin Rush's disciples and had spent a decade treating soldiers whose minds had fractured under the weight of war. He was accustomed to the labyrinth of human suffering, but Samuel Brenner's testimony, delivered across 16 sessions in a locked room on the hospital's 3rd floor, would test even his clinical detachment. The case would come to be known in whispered conversation and sealed reports as the Sexton's account. It was never widely publicized. The families involved requested silence. The church authorities involved requested the same, but the documents survived, filed in the basement archives of the Providence Municipal Library, where they remain today, yellowed, water-stained, and largely unread. Samuel Brenner had been born in 1857 in the township of Grayling, Connecticut, a settlement of fewer than 300 souls situated in the hill country west of New Haven. The town existed in that peculiar American isolation common to post-war New England, connected to the wider world by a single rail line that ran twice weekly, surrounded by dense second-growth forest that had reclaimed farmland abandoned during the war years. The soil was rocky and unforgiving. The winters were long. The primary industries were timber and stonework, both of which employed men whose hands grew hard and whose conversations grew sparse. Brenner's father had been a stonemason who died of consumption when Samuel was 11. His mother took in laundry and mending. There were 2 younger sisters, both of whom succumbed to scarlet fever in the winter of 1870. The family Bible recorded their deaths in his mother's careful script. Samuel left school at 13 to work in the quarry. By 16, he had apprenticed with the town's sexton, an elderly Congregationalist named Thaddeus Crane, who tended the burial ground adjacent to Grayling's single church. The work of a sexton was solitary by nature. It involved the digging of graves, the maintenance of burial plots, the ringing of bells for services, and the general upkeep of church property. Crane was a methodical man who kept detailed records, measurements of grave depth, notation of coffin construction, observations about soil drainage. He taught Brenner not merely to dig, but to document. A grave, Crane was known to say, is a piece of infrastructure. It must be done correctly, or the earth will reject what we have given it. When Crane died in 1879, Brenner inherited his position. He was 22 years old. He lived in a small cabin on the church grounds, a structure of 2 rooms with a stone hearth and a single window facing the cemetery. He attended services every Sunday. He was regarded as reliable, if quiet. The church ledger from this period shows steady employment, an average of 12 burials per year, in keeping with the town's modest population and its aging demographic. But Grayling was changing. The timber industry had stripped the surrounding hills with mechanical efficiency. By 1882, the mills had closed. Families began to leave. The rail service reduced to once per week. The church congregation dwindled. The Reverend Marcus Holloway, who had presided over Grayling's spiritual life for 2 decades, grew elderly and frail. His sermons, once concerned with salvation and grace, increasingly turned toward themes of abandonment and desolation. He spoke of God's silence. He spoke of the wilderness reclaiming what man had built. He spoke, in his final years, of towns that vanished from maps, leaving only their dead behind. It was in this atmosphere, this slow erasure of community, that Samuel Brenner began his work in earnest. The camera had belonged to Thaddeus Crane. It was a bellow-style field camera, cumbersome but portable, designed for landscape documentation. Crane had used it occasionally to photograph the cemetery for maintenance records. Views of drainage problems, fallen headstones, encroaching vegetation. When Brenner inherited Crane's possessions, the camera was among them, along with instructions for preparing collodion plates and developing them in a makeshift darkroom. Brenner's first photograph of a grave was taken in October of 1883. The subject was the burial plot of Mrs. Eleanor Marsh, a widow of 71 who had died of pneumonia. The photograph, later examined by Dr. Whitmore, showed nothing unusual: a rectangular patch of disturbed earth, a temporary wooden marker, the bare trees of late autumn in soft focus behind. The composition was centered and level. The exposure was correct. It appeared to be simply a record, no different from Crane's old maintenance photographs. But Brenner continued. Every burial he performed was subsequently photographed. He developed the plates in his cabin by lamplight, using chemicals ordered from a supplier in New Haven. He mounted each plate in a protective sleeve and stored them in chronological order. By 1885, he had accumulated 32 such images. By 1887, 58. The ledger he maintained alongside these photographs grew increasingly detailed, not merely measurements and dates, but observations. Soil resistant at 4 feet. Clay layer. Water seepage from northeast corner. And later, no mourners present. Service lasted 11 minutes. Coffin constructed of pine. Joints poor. The town continued its decline. By 1888, Grayling's population had fallen below 200. The general store closed. The schoolhouse stood empty. Reverend Holloway died in his sleep in February of that year, and no replacement was sent. The church building itself fell into disrepair, shingles missing from the roof, paint peeling from the clapboards, weeds growing thick in the churchyard. Samuel Brenner remained. He continued his duties without oversight, without congregation, without ceremony. It was during this period that the nature of his work changed. The first disappearance occurred in late summer of 1888. A transient laborer named John Cavanaugh, who had been working on a neighboring farm, failed to appear for his wages. The farmer assumed he had moved on. Such occurrences were common in rural areas. Men drifted, following work or fleeing debt. No report was filed. But Brenner's ledger, examined later, contained an entry dated August 29, 1888. Burial, unmarked. Northeast section, 6 feet. Sandy loam. Good drainage. No service performed. A second disappearance followed in November. Margaret Poole, a young woman of 18 who had been living with relatives after her parents' deaths, was last seen walking toward the village center. She never arrived. Her relatives, themselves preparing to leave Grayling, assumed she had eloped or run away. The constable made perfunctory inquiries. The case was noted and forgotten. Brenner's ledger. November 14th, 1888. Burial, unmarked. Western boundary, near stone wall, 5 1/2 feet. Root obstruction at 4 feet. Removed. Frost beginning. Difficult digging. In April of 1889, a peddler named Martin Voss passed through Grayling on his circuit. Voss sold household goods, tools, and patent medicines to rural communities throughout Connecticut and western Rhode Island. He traveled by cart, sleeping in barns or, when weather permitted, beneath his wagon. He had been coming to Grayling for 15 years, and he noticed its decay with the practical eye of a man who tracked economic patterns for survival. Voss later testified that he arrived in Grayling on April 10th, a cold morning with frost still on the ground. The town appeared nearly deserted. He counted perhaps 15 occupied houses. The church stood silent. He made 3 sales that day: a hatchet, a bolt of cloth, and a bottle of liniment. That evening, lacking better accommodation, he sought permission to sleep in the church stable. Finding no one to ask, he simply unhitched his horse and settled in. From the stable, he had a clear view of the cemetery and Brenner's cabin beyond. He watched Brenner emerge at dusk, carrying a spade. This was unremarkable. Sexton's work often continued after dark, particularly in winter when daylight was scarce. But Voss noticed that Brenner walked to a section of the cemetery that appeared to have no marked graves. He watched Brenner dig for what he estimated to be 2 hours. When Brenner returned to his cabin, he carried a spade and something else, a bundle wrapped in canvas. Voss thought little of it at the time. He slept fitfully in the cold stable and departed at first light. But 3 months later, in July, his route brought him through Grayling again. The town had diminished further. He counted fewer than 10 occupied dwellings. The church door stood open, revealing an interior stripped of furnishings, and the cemetery had changed. Where there had been perhaps 40 marked graves, there now appeared to be 60 or more plots of disturbed earth. Rectangular patches of soil, darker than their surroundings, arranged in rough rows that extended into what had previously been unused ground. Voss approached Brenner's cabin. He found the sexton at work in a small garden behind the structure, cultivating vegetables with mechanical precision. Voss inquired, in the casual manner of a traveling man seeking gossip, whether there had been an epidemic. Brenner replied that there had not. Voss mentioned the number of fresh graves. Brenner stated that he was conducting maintenance work, regrading plots, improving drainage. The explanation was plausible. Voss purchased nothing and moved on. But the image remained with him, those dark rectangles of earth, too many and too regular. When news of Brenner's confession reached him in March of 1891, he contacted the Providence authorities. His testimony, recorded by Dr. Whitmore's assistant, provided the only external observation of Brenner's activities during the crucial period of 1888 to 1890. Between August of 1888 and February of 1891, Samuel Brenner murdered 17 people. The victims were transients, travelers, elderly solitaries, and individuals whose absence would not provoke immediate inquiry. He killed them in his cabin. By various means, strangulation, blunt trauma, suffocation, he buried them in the Grayling Cemetery, in unmarked graves dug according to the same specifications he had learned from Thaddeus Crane. He photographed each burial site. He maintained his ledger with clerical precision. He explained his methodology to Dr. Whitmore across multiple sessions, speaking in the flat, affectless tone that characterized his confession. He had not killed from passion or hatred. He had not killed for material gain. The possessions of his victims were minimal, and those items of value he sold discreetly or discarded. He had killed, he stated, because the work required completion. Grayling was dying. The living were leaving. But the cemetery remained, and with it, his obligation as sexton. The graves required tending. The plots required filling. He had been trained to maintain order in the landscape of death, and as the community dissolved, that order became his sole purpose. The living had abandoned Grayling, but the dead could not leave, and so he provided them with company. It was proper work, he told Dr. Whitmore during their fourth session. The graves were dug to correct depth. The burial was performed according to standard practice. Each was documented. There was no negligence. When asked why he photographed the graves, Brenner stated that it was necessary for record keeping. Just as Crane had taught him to document drainage and soil conditions, he documented his own work. The photographs proved that the labor had been completed correctly. They were evidence of his diligence. Dr. Whitmore inquired whether Brenner understood that he had committed murder. Brenner confirmed that he understood the legal terminology, but he repeatedly returned to the concept of duty. He had been entrusted with a cemetery. He had maintained it. When the church abandoned Grayling, when the reverend died and was not replaced, when the congregation vanished and the building fell into ruin still, the cemetery remained. Still, the work continued. Someone had to tend them, he said. Someone had to remember. The investigation required verification. In late April of 1891, a team consisting of 2 Providence police detectives, a county coroner, and 3 laborers traveled to Grayling. They brought Brenner's ledger and photographs. They brought shovels and measuring equipment. They brought a sense of grim duty. The cemetery at Grayling was silent and overgrown. The marked graves, those with headstones and recorded burials, occupied perhaps a quarter of the grounds. The remainder, the area that Martin Voss had noticed, consisted of disturbed earth in various stages of settling. The grass grew unevenly. The soil patterns were visible from a distance. Using Brenner's ledger as a guide, the team selected 6 plots for exhumation. They worked methodically, beginning at dawn and continuing until light failed. The ground was soft from spring rains. The digging proceeded quickly. They found human remains in all 6 excavations. The bodies were in various states of decomposition, corresponding to the dates in Brenner's ledger. The burials had been performed competently, bodies positioned correctly, grave depth appropriate, no evidence of haste or carelessness. In several cases, the deceased were clothed in garments that could be matched to descriptions of missing persons from surrounding townships. One body, buried in October of 1889, was identified by a distinctive brass button as belonging to a traveling preacher who had last been seen passing through the region. The coroner's report noted evidence of violent death in 4 of the 6 examined cases: skull fractures, cervical dislocation, signs of asphyxiation, but he also noted the care with which the bodies had been interred. There was no mutilation, no evidence of desecration. The graves had been prepared and filled with the precision of professional work. The team did not exhume all suspected burial sites. The expense and labor required to excavate potentially 17 unmarked graves exceeded available resources. Moreover, Brenner's confession provided sufficient detail that full archaeological recovery was deemed unnecessary for legal purposes. The 6 exhumations confirmed the fundamental accuracy of his account. The remaining graves were marked with temporary stakes and left undisturbed. The cemetery at Grayling was sealed by court order. The few remaining families in the township were relocated. The church building was demolished the following year. By 1895, Grayling had vanished from most maps. The cemetery remained, gradually consumed by forest, its boundaries marked only by remnants of stone wall and the occasional toppled headstone. Samuel Brenner never stood trial. Dr. Whitmore's psychiatric evaluation, submitted to the court in June of 1891, concluded that Brenner suffered from a form of monomania, an obsessive fixation on duty that had calcified into delusional purpose. He was not, in Whitmore's assessment, insane in the conventional sense. He understood right from wrong. He recognized the illegality of his actions, but he operated within a moral framework so rigid and self-contained that external law had become, for him, subordinate to the obligations of his position. The court committed Brenner to the Rhode Island State Asylum for the insane, where he was housed in the ward reserved for criminal patients. He remained there for the rest of his life, a span of 31 years. The asylum records, preserved in fragmentary form, indicate that he was a model patient. He worked in the asylum garden. He attended chapel services. He read extensively from the limited library available to inmates. He never spoke of his crimes except in the clinical sessions required by his psychiatrists, and even then, only to clarify factual details. He continued, until his death in 1922, to insist that his work had been necessary, that someone had been required to maintain the cemetery, that the dead deserved attention and proper burial, that he had fulfilled his duty to the best of his ability under circumstances of abandonment and institutional failure. The photographs were retained as evidence and never returned to him. They remained in the Providence Police Archive until 1947, when a fire destroyed much of the department's historical storage. A few plates survived, transferred to the State Historical Society. These images exist now as curiosities, dark rectangles of earth, carefully framed, precisely exposed, documenting work that no one witnessed and that no one, in the end, had requested. The families of Brenner's victims, once identified, were notified according to legal procedure. Most had already presumed their missing relatives dead, lost to accident, disease, or the simple attrition of a population in motion. The confirmation provided no comfort, only closure of a bitter variety. Several families petitioned to have remains returned for proper burial in family plots. Others declined, stating that disturbing the graves a second time served no purpose. No monument was erected at Grayling. No collective memorial marked the site. The town had ceased to exist. The victims had been transients and isolates, people whose lives had already been defined by absence. Their deaths became another form of disappearance noted in court records, filed in archives, and gradually forgotten. Dr. Whitmore published a single professional paper on the case in 1893 in the Journal of Mental Science. He framed Brenner's pathology as an example of what he termed occupational monomania, a condition in which the purpose of a trade or profession becomes detached from social context and elevated to absolute principle. His paper was read, but not widely cited. The case was too particular, too odd, to serve as a useful model for general psychiatric theory. What remained, in the end, was the question that Whitmore himself acknowledged he could not answer. At what point does duty become delusion? When does the maintenance of order become its own form of chaos? Brenner had been trained to dig graves, to maintain the boundary between life and death, to preserve the landscape where the living remembered the dead. But when the living departed, when the community dissolved, when no one remained to remember, had he been preserving order, or had he been creating a grotesque fiction of permanence in a place already abandoned? The land where Grayling stood has been reclaimed by state forest. The old road that connected the township to the rail line has been absorbed by newer routes. The foundations of houses lie buried beneath decades of leaf fall. The church site is marked only by a depression in the earth where the structure's weight once compressed the soil, and the cemetery exists as an unmarked tract within the forest, known to researchers and historians, but inaccessible and unnamed. Occasionally, hikers report finding old stonework in the woods, remnants of walls, the corner of a foundation, weathered markers with inscriptions rendered illegible by time. Occasionally, someone stumbles upon an area where the trees grow strangely, where the ground feels different underfoot, where rectangles of earth can be discerned beneath the moss and undergrowth. These are noted and passed. The forest keeps what it has taken back. Samuel Brenner's ledger resides in the Providence Municipal Library, Special Collections, Box 47B. The surviving photographs are housed in the Rhode Island Historical Society, catalogued under Unknown Providence Cemetery Documentation, circa 1880s through 1890s. Researchers who request these materials are few. The story, when it is told at all, is told as a footnote to studies of rural depopulation, or as a case study in forensic psychiatry, or as an example of the dissolution of New England townships in the post-war decades. But the images remain. Dark earth, careful framing, precise documentation of work performed in absolute solitude. Each photograph a record of erasure not merely of the individuals buried, but of the entire apparatus of community that had once given meaning to the act of burial itself. Each frame contains a grave that no one requested, mourned by no one, tended by a man who understood himself to be faithful. In the end, Samuel Brenner kept his records. He documented his diligence. He walked into a hospital and presented his evidence, seeking not absolution, but acknowledgement. He wanted someone to know that the work had been completed, that he had not abandoned his post, that in a place where everything else had failed and vanished, he had remained. And the photographs testify. He did. In the most terrible and irrevocable way, he did. The dead do not remember. The living do not stay. But the earth holds what is given to it, and the record, however dark, however unwanted, persists. Asterisk. Thus concluded the investigation into what became known among a small circle of legal and medical professionals as the Sexton's account, a case notable not for its violence, which was methodical rather than passionate, but for the question it posed and could not answer, whether a man can be condemned for faithfulness itself when the object of that faith has long since turned to ash. Asterisk.